For 20 days the army halted at Tarsus. It seemed indeed, at one time, that at this point the expedition would break down altogether. For the Hellene troops, on whom Cyrus based all his hopes of conquest, became restive and dissatisfied. They had been engaged to punish the Pisidian marauders, but had now passed the country of the Pisidians and were naturally beginning to ask themselves what was the real object of the expedition. Their suspicions were increased moreover by the opposition of the Cilician prince. His resistance had certainly been of the feeblest, but still he had made an attempt to stop their passage through his mountains and had thus declared himself the enemy of Cyrus. What reason could he have had for taking such a course, were it not that he had received instructions from the great king to bar the passage of Cyrus, because he was a rebel and was advancing to unseat him from his throne? The Hellenes now discovered for the first time that they were intended to march on for hundreds of miles into the very heart of the Persian Empire, and then risk their lives in battle against the great king, of whose boundless resources they had often heard. For such a mad enterprise as this, they had not been engaged, they said, and they would never have agreed to enter upon it. For, putting aside the extreme length of the march to Susa, how could they expect that in case the hopes of Cyrus should be doomed to disappointment, it would be possible for them, a mere handful of strangers in an unknown country, to break through the ranks of the enemy and make their way back to their own land? The Hellene mercenaries were no mere collection of soldiers of fortune, picked up anywhere and ready to undertake any service. On the contrary, they were, for the most part, respectable citizens of Hellas, who had taken service under Cyrus with the expectation of soon returning to their families laden with spoil. Every day their murmurs became louder, as their suspicions received additional confirmation, and at Tarsus they made a formal protest, declaring to the officers who had enlisted them that they were betrayed and that nothing would induce them to go a step farther. Almost all the officers were of the same mind, but there was one who thought otherwise. This was Clearchus the Spartan, a man who had received from Cyrus many favors and who was anxious to prove his gratitude by doing his utmost to forward the prince's wishes. To Cyrus the ultimate decision of the Hellene troops was of the gravest consequence. In his mind, there was no question that the success of his plans depended on his being able to reckon upon their help. Clearchus was at this time about 50 years of age. He possessed the entire confidence of Cyrus and was in fact the only person who had been told from the first the real, though secret, object of the expedition. He was a man born to be a soldier. A quiet, easy life in his native land was an existence altogether without charm for him. War, with all its dangers and hardships, was his natural element, and into this favorite pursuit he threw all the energy of his character. He personally supervised the provisioning of his men, and this was only one instance of the extreme care with which he attended to every detail. Nothing that could contribute to the efficiency of his company was too insignificant for his notice. He had nearly all the qualifications of a great general, but in one respect he failed signally. For whilst he could always command the admiration and respect of his men, he was quite incapable of gaining their affection. He had not indeed any desire to do so, for he believed in discipline and in nothing else. His orders were strict and severe, and he required instant obedience to the most minute particular. He was accustomed to saying that an army without discipline was utterly worthless and that soldiers should fear their officers more than they feared the enemy. Yet, although he was so careful to exact obedience from others, he himself was but a poor hand at rendering obedience. The soldiers under the command of Clearchus never saw him unbend. His face was always stern, his brow contracted, his eye restless. He punished his men constantly and severely, and often in moments of passion did things that he afterwards sincerely regretted. The consequence was that when there was no immediate danger impending, his men were often tempted to leave him and take service under a less strict officer. But in any time of danger or difficulty, the soldiers would follow Clearchus more readily than anyone else, for they had unbounded belief in his ability as a general. Nothing ever disturbed his presence of mind. However threatening the danger, he always met it with perfect calm and self-possession. At such times, the stern, unbending face of Clearchus seemed to his men a tower of strength. The sight of his coolness and insensibility to fear inspired them with courage, and they felt an enthusiasm for their general, in which for the moment something like affection was added to respect. When first the soldiers of his company declared their intention of marching no farther, Clearchus refused to listen to them. He thought he had sufficient influence over them to compel them to do as he wished, but in this he was mistaken. For when he sternly ordered them to continue the march and placed himself at their head to lead them on whether they would or no, they took up stones to throw at him, and, if he had not quickly made his escape, they would have stoned him to death. It was clear that any attempt to enforce discipline would be of no avail in such a case as this, but, for all that, Clearchus did not intend to be beaten. He knew how to maneuver as well as how to fight, and had no difficulty in finding ways and means to gain his end. After allowing a little time for the excitement of the soldiers to subside, he sent to summon them to a meeting. They were at first disinclined to go, but they said to one another, "We may as well hear what it is that he wants us to do. But no matter what he says, we will be firm and hold to our decision." When they came to the meeting, they found Clearchus so changed that they would hardly have recognized him. Instead of the stern officer with angry brow and flashing eyes, there stood before them a silent, downcast man, who wept like a child. Never had they seen him so deeply moved. At last he began to speak in a low, agitated voice. "Comrades," he said, "be not surprised that I am grieved at your decision. I have every cause to be grateful to Cyrus, who has been to me the best of friends, and for this reason it was my earnest hope that with your assistance I might be able to repay his kindness by helping him in his present undertaking. But you are not willing, and it shall never be said of me that I took the part of a barbarian against my own countrymen. I declare therefore that I will follow you, for to me you are country, friends, comrades. Without you I can neither help a friend nor harm an enemy." On hearing these words, the soldiers felt perfectly satisfied and at once made peace with their general. Moreover, 2,000 men, belonging to 2 other companies, left the generals under whom they had enlisted, in order to join the company of Clearchus. For they believed that having once said that he would not march against the great king, Clearchus would hold to his resolution whatever happened, whereas it seemed very possible that the other officers might be won over by Cyrus, notwithstanding their present protests. When Cyrus heard what had passed at the meeting, he was vexed and disappointed and sent a messenger to summon Clearchus to his presence. Clearchus, however, refused to go and took care that the soldiers should know of his refusal, but sent word secretly to Cyrus that he hoped all would yet be well. Several more days went by, and then Clearchus again summoned the soldiers to a meeting. This time anyone was allowed to attend, whether he belonged to the company of Clearchus or not, so that there was a very large gathering. Clearchus was the first to speak. "Comrades," he said, "we have now broken with Cyrus. We are no longer his mercenaries, and he is no longer our paymaster. Naturally he is angry with us for deserting him, and, as for me, I dare not show myself in his presence, for, although he is the best of friends, he is at the same time a relentless enemy, and his power is great. We shall do well therefore to lose no time in considering how we may return in safety and, above all, how it will be possible, without the help of Cyrus, to obtain food for the march. Let whosoever will now speak his mind." First one man and then another rose to speak, some saying what occurred to them at the moment, and others according to instructions previously received. For Clearchus had made his own preparations for the meeting and had prompted several of the soldiers as to what they should say. Some were to speak in favor of returning home at once, and others were to raise difficulties. After some of the other soldiers had spoken, one of the men who had been prompted by Clearchus rose and began to urge with great eagerness an immediate return home, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. "To begin with," he said, "we must lay in a store of provisions, and then ask Cyrus to give us ships to take us home by sea from Tarsus. Or, if he refuses that, we must ask him to supply us with a guide who knows the country to take us back by land. We must act promptly moreover, lest the people of the country treat us as enemies and come out against us." This speech was received with great applause. But immediately another of those who had been previously told what to say rose to reply. "All that you have just heard," he said, "is utter nonsense. How can we expect to get food, when the only market is in the camp of the barbarians? Do you suppose that, after we have broken with Cyrus, he is likely to be so pleasant and obliging as to allow us to take provisions out of his camp for our journey? And the ships that he has brought here for his own use, is it likely that he will part with them in order that we may get home comfortably? Then as regards the guide, is it to be expected that he will grant a guide to us, who by our desertion will be doing him the greatest injury and crossing all his plans? Even if he were to supply us with ships, I, for one, should expect the ships to be sunk in mid-sea in order that we might be drowned, or, if he gave us a guide, I should fear that the guide would lead us into some place where we could not fail to perish. This plan will never do. I propose instead that we nominate certain persons to go with Clearchus to Cyrus and ask him what it is exactly that he wants of us. If he proposes some such enterprise as those on which our countrymen have been employed before, then let us follow him. If on the other hand it appears likely that his plans will involve us in great toils and dangers, we must ask him either to give us good reasons for advancing, or else consent to our going back. Then we shall either accompany him as friends, or else be allowed to return in peace. This speech made the desired impression, for the Hellenes could not but see that there was far more sense in the apprehensions of the last speaker than in the hopeful view of the man who had preceded him, and, accordingly, when the proposal to send a deputation to Cyrus was put to the meeting, a great show of hands was raised in favor of it. The members of the deputation were therefore chosen at once and sent away on their errand. Cyrus granted the messengers an interview and agreed to answer their questions. He made no mention of attacking the Pisidians, still less of marching against the great king, but spoke of an enemy of his, a powerful satrap named Abracamas, who lived on the banks of the Euphrates at a distance of 12 days' march from Tarsus. It was for the purpose of fighting this satrap, he said, that he wanted the help of the Hellenes, for Abracamas had a great army under his command. If he held his ground, he should be punished, but if on the other hand he should save himself by flight, then, in that case, it would be necessary to consider further what would have to be done. With this answer the messengers returned to their comrades, and the Hellenes declared themselves ready to remain in the service of Cyrus, on condition that he would increase their pay. To this he readily consented and promised that, instead of receiving every month 1 daric as before, the private soldiers should in future have 1.5 darics. In like proportion, the captains were to have 3 darics instead of 2, and the generals 6 darics instead of 4. The Hellenes were in the position of a man whose path lies through a bog. After he has advanced some little way, he begins to consider whether it would not be better to turn back, but, finding that this is just as difficult as to go forward, he thinks it a pity to waste the effort he has already made and decides to continue. So to the Hellenes it seemed that to return promised to be no less dangerous than to advance. The more clear-sighted were by this time perfectly aware that, whatever Cyrus might say, or refrain from saying, his ultimate design was to proclaim war against the great king. But the great mass of the soldiers, although they knew in their hearts that this was his real intention, preferred not to think too much about it and persisted in hoping that, after all, it might turn out to be something else.